Into the symbol's power, Kestrel Yamamoto walked through the hallways of Roosevelt High School with her head down, clutching her worn leather messenger bag against her chest. Her dark hair fell like a curtain around her face, hiding the intricate silver pendant that hung from a thin chain around her neck. She was small for her age, barely reaching most students' shoulders, with delicate features that made her appear fragile and vulnerable. Her oversized navy blue sweater bore a distinctive embroidered symbol on the chest, an ancient Japanese character that most students couldn't read, surrounded by delicate cherry blossom branches that her grandmother had stitched by hand. The sweater had belonged to her late grandfather, a man she'd never met, but whose legacy lived in every thread of the garment. Her grandmother had given it to her before she moved to America, along with years of training that nobody at Roosevelt High suspected. But Kestrel kept that part of her life buried deep, just like she kept her head down in the hallways. "There goes the weird foreign girl again," sneered Braden Tucker as she passed his locker. He was the kind of student who owned every room he entered, tall, broad-shouldered, with perfectly styled blonde hair, and a smile that could charm teachers and intimidate classmates in equal measure. His Letterman jacket hung open, revealing a designer shirt that probably cost more than Kestrel's entire wardrobe. Beside him stood his constant companions, Riker Mills, whose red hair and freckled face might have looked friendly if not for the cruel glint in his green eyes, and Madison Pierce, whose perfectly straight blonde hair and designer clothes made her the unofficial queen of Roosevelt High's social hierarchy. Madison's laugh was sharp and cutting, designed to make others feel small. "Did you see that ugly sweater she wears every day?" Madison whispered loud enough for half the hallway to hear. "It's like she's trying to advertise that she doesn't belong here." Kestrel's fingers tightened around her bag's strap, but she kept walking. She'd learned early in her time at Roosevelt that responding only made things worse. The best strategy was to become invisible, to slip through the day unnoticed and get home where she could practice her forms in the garage, away from prying eyes and cruel comments. Mrs. Patterson, her English teacher, barely looked up when Braden made paper airplanes during class. Mr. Rodriguez, who taught history, actually chuckled when Riker made jokes about foreign exchange students, even though Kestrel had been born in California. The adults who should have protected her seemed to exist in a different world, one where the daily humiliations she endured were invisible. During lunch, Kestrel sat alone at a corner table in the cafeteria, picking at her homemade bento box, while other students clustered in their social groups. She could hear fragments of conversation, discussions about the upcoming homecoming dance, complaints about Friday's chemistry test, plans for weekend parties she'd never be invited to attend. "Hey, Japan girl," Braden's voice carried across the cafeteria like a challenge. "What's that weird food you're eating? Sushi for lunch?" The cafeteria fell silent as dozens of eyes turned toward Kestrel's table. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she kept her gaze fixed on her rice and vegetables. It wasn't sushi. It was simple rice with pickled vegetables and a small piece of grilled salmon. But explaining would only give them more ammunition. "Maybe she doesn't understand English," Madison added, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Should we speak slower? Use smaller words?" Riker laughed and began speaking in an exaggerated, patronizing tone. "Do you understand us?" Kestrel's hands trembled slightly as she closed her bento box, but she remained silent. Inside her chest, something burned with quiet fury, but she pushed it down the way her grandmother had taught her. Control was everything. Discipline was strength. Violence was the last resort of those who had exhausted all other options. After school, she hurried toward the exit, hoping to avoid another confrontation. But as she passed through the main corridor, she noticed a crowd gathering near the trophy case. In the center of the group stood Jamie Chen, a quiet student from her chemistry class. Jamie's usually neat appearance was disheveled, his shirt torn and his face flushed with humiliation. "Come on, Chen," Braden was saying, his voice filled with mock encouragement. Just admit you cheated on the test. Everyone knows kids like you are only good at math and science because you cheat. Kestrel stopped walking. Jamie had never cheated on anything. She'd seen him studying in the library every afternoon, working harder than anyone else in their class. He was shy like her, another target for Braden's cruelty, but he was also kind. He'd once helped her pick up her books when she'd tripped in the hallway, and he'd never joined in when others made fun of her accent or her clothes. I didn't cheat, Jamie said quietly, his voice barely audible above the crowd's murmurs. I studied for weeks. Right, Madison laughed, and I'm sure that fancy calculator Daddy bought you had nothing to do with your perfect score. Kestrel watched Jamie's shoulders slump in defeat, and something inside her chest tightened. She knew exactly how he felt, that crushing sensation of being judged and found guilty without evidence, of having every achievement questioned and diminished. But she also knew she couldn't intervene. Not yet. Not until she was ready. That evening, in her grandmother's garage, Kestrel practiced her kata with more intensity than usual. Each movement flowed into the next like water, but beneath the graceful surface lay devastating power. Her grandfather's style was traditional Shotokan karate, passed down through generations of their family. But her grandmother had added her own modifications, techniques that emphasized speed and precision over brute strength. You must never use these skills for revenge, her grandmother had warned her during their training sessions. Only for protection, only when there is no other choice. But what happened when protection meant standing up for others? What happened when staying silent became complicity? The next morning brought a new humiliation. As Kestrel approached her locker, she found a handwritten note taped to the metal door. In Madison's distinctive handwriting, it read, "Foreign girls don't belong at American schools. Go back where you came from." Heat rose in Kestrel's cheeks as she crumpled the note and shoved it into her bag. Around her, other students pretended not to notice, but she could feel their eyes on her back like physical weight. Some looked away in embarrassment, others watched with the morbid curiosity of people observing a car accident. During third period biology, things escalated further. Mr. Williams had assigned lab partners for a dissection project, and by cruel coincidence, Kestrel found herself paired with Riker Mills. As they worked over their specimen, he made a show of holding his nose. "Do you always smell like that weird food you eat?" he asked loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "It's like fish and rice and, I don't know, sadness." Several students snickered, and Kestrel's hands stilled over their shared worksheet. She could feel her carefully maintained control beginning to crack, like ice forming hairline fractures under pressure. "I'm just saying," Riker continued, encouraged by the attention, "maybe you could try eating normal food, like hamburgers or pizza. You know, American food." "I am American," Kestrel said quietly, her first words of defense in weeks. "Sure you are," Riker laughed. "And I'm the Emperor of Japan." The breaking point came 2 days later, during lunch period. Kestrel was sitting at her usual corner table when she noticed Jamie Chen approaching, carrying his tray with obvious nervousness. He glanced around the cafeteria as if checking for predators, then sat down across from her. "Is it okay if I sit here?" he asked quietly. Kestrel nodded, surprised but pleased to have company. They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes, two outcasts finding solidarity in their shared isolation. "I wanted to thank you," Jamie said suddenly. "For what?" "For not laughing. The other day, when they were..." He gestured vaguely toward the center of the cafeteria where Braden held court. "When they were saying those things about me cheating, you were the only one who didn't laugh." Before Kestrel could respond, a shadow fell across their table. Braden Tucker stood behind Jamie, flanked by Madison and Riker wearing his trademark smirk. Well, well, Braden said, his voice carrying that tone of false friendliness that always preceded cruelty. Look who found a friend, the two weirdos sitting together. How cute. Jamie's face flushed red, but he didn't move from his seat. Kestrel felt a surge of respect for his quiet courage. Actually, Madison said, her eyes fixed on Kestrel's sweater, I've been wondering about that ugly thing she wears every day. What is that symbol supposed to mean? Probably says loser in Chinese, Riker suggested. It's Japanese, Kestrel said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm building in her chest. Oh, she speaks, Braden laughed. So what does it mean then? Please make fun of me. I don't belong here. Kestrel's fingers instinctively went to the embroidered symbol on her chest. The character meant courage in Japanese, stitched there by her grandmother's patient hands as a reminder of the strength that ran in their family's blood. The cherry blossoms represented the beauty and fragility of life, the cycles of growth and renewal that her grandfather had dedicated his life to protecting. It means courage, she said, her voice growing stronger. Madison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Courage? That's rich, coming from someone who's never stood up for herself in her life. Maybe we should test that courage, Braden said, reaching toward Kestrel's sweater. Let's see how brave you really are. His fingers grasped the edge of her sleeve, and something inside Kestrel exploded. Don't touch my sweater. The words came out like a growl, low and dangerous, completely different from her usual quiet voice. Braden paused, surprised by the transformation, but his grip didn't loosen. What are you going to do about it, foreign girl? Your granddaddy isn't here to protect you. That was his mistake. The moment he mentioned her grandfather, every lesson her grandmother had taught her about restraint and control evaporated like morning mist. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the man whose memory lived in every thread of the sweater, whose legacy of protecting others she carried in her blood. Kestrel's hand moved faster than anyone could track, her fingers closing around Braden's wrist in a grip that made him gasp with sudden pain. Years of training had given her hands the strength of steel cables, and she applied just enough pressure to make her point clear. Let go of my sweater, she said, her voice deadly quiet. What the hell? Braden started, but his words cut off as Kestrel's grip tightened. His face went pale as he realized he couldn't break free. I said let go. The cafeteria had gone silent around them, dozens of students watching in shock as tiny Kestrel Yamamoto faced down the school's biggest bully. Madison and Riker stood frozen, unsure how to process what they were seeing. Braden released her sweater and tried to pull away, but Kestrel held his wrist for another heartbeat, letting him feel exactly how outmatched he was. Then she released him and stood up from her chair, her movement fluid and controlled. Stay away from me, she said clearly. Stay away from Jamie and never, ever touch my sweater again. Braden rubbed his wrist, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. You think you're tough now? This isn't over, freak. Yes, Kestrel said, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had finally found their strength. It is. But she was wrong. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Kestrel arrived at school to find her locker decorated with crude drawings and hateful messages. Someone had torn pages from a manga comic and taped them to the metal door with the words, "Go back to Cartoonland," scrawled across them in black marker. As she cleaned the mess from her locker, other students watched from a distance. Some looked ashamed, others curious, but none approached to help. The invisible line that separated her from the rest of Roosevelt High had become more pronounced than ever. During morning assembly, Principal Henderson announced the upcoming Spirit Week activities, including a martial arts demonstration by the school's karate club. Kestrel listened with half attention until she heard Braden's voice behind her. I bet foreign girl thinks she knows karate, he whispered to his friends, just loud enough for her to hear. Maybe we should sign her up for the demonstration. Let everyone see how pathetic she really is. That afternoon, as Kestrel walked toward the parking lot, she found her path blocked by all three of her tormentors. They had chosen their location carefully, behind the gymnasium, out of sight from teachers and most students. "We need to have a conversation," Braden said, his earlier embarrassment replaced by cold anger, "about what happened in the cafeteria." "There's nothing to discuss," Kestrel replied, but she could feel the familiar coil of tension building in her muscles. "Oh, I think there is," Madison said, pulling out her phone. "See, we've been thinking about your little tough girl act yesterday, and we decided it would be fun to get it on video this time." Riker moved to flank her on the left, while Madison positioned herself for the best camera angle. Kestrel realized they had planned this confrontation carefully, choosing a location where they could corner her without witnesses. "Here's what's going to happen," Braden continued, his voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd learned to hate. "You're going to apologize for embarrassing me yesterday. Then you're going to take off that ugly sweater and throw it in the dumpster where it belongs. And, if we're feeling generous," Madison added, "we might not post the video of you crying and begging for forgiveness." Kestrel looked at each of them in turn, measuring distances and angles the way her grandmother had taught her. Three opponents, all larger than her, positioned to cut off her escape routes. But they had made several crucial mistakes. First, they had underestimated her completely, viewing her as nothing more than a victim to be bullied. Second, they had chosen to attack the one thing in the world that meant more to her than her own safety. And third, they had trapped themselves in an enclosed space with someone who had been trained since childhood to fight multiple opponents. "I'm waiting," Braden said, stepping closer. "Take off the sweater." Instead of backing away, Kestrel did something none of them expected. She smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had finally been given permission to stop holding back. "You want my sweater?" she asked, her voice carrying a new note of confidence. "Come and take it." Braden lunged forward, his hands reaching for the precious garment. But where his fingers expected to find fabric, they found only empty air. Kestrel had moved aside with liquid grace, her body flowing like water around his clumsy attack. Before he could recover his balance, her elbow connected with his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs in a sharp exhale. As he doubled over, gasping, her knee came up to meet his descending face with surgical precision. The crack of breaking cartilage echoed off the gymnasium walls. Riker rushed her from the left, his fists swinging wildly, but Kestrel had already shifted her weight and position. She caught his leading arm, used his own momentum against him, and sent him tumbling over her hip to crash into the concrete wall behind her. Madison screamed and dropped her phone, the device clattering across the asphalt as she realized her friends were being dismantled by someone a third their size. "Stop!" Madison shouted. "You're crazy!" But Kestrel wasn't listening. Years of suppressed anger and humiliation had found their outlet, channeled through techniques passed down through generations of her family. Every movement was precise, controlled, designed to neutralize threats without causing permanent damage. Braden struggled to his feet, blood streaming from his broken nose, his eyes wide with shock and fear. This wasn't how the confrontation was supposed to go. He was bigger, stronger, had two friends to help him. How was this tiny girl making them look like amateurs? "You freak!" he snarled, charging at her again. "I'll kill you!" This time, Kestrel didn't move aside. Instead, she stepped into his attack, her hands moving in a complex pattern that redirected his force and sent him spinning to the ground. Before he could rise, her foot pressed against his throat, applying just enough pressure to make breathing difficult. "You will never touch my sweater again," she said, her voice calm despite the fury in her eyes. "You will never call me names." You will never hurt Jamie or any other student who can't defend themselves. Riker groaned and tried to sit up, but Kestrel's free hand gestured in his direction and he froze, recognizing the promise of more pain if he moved. I could end this, Kestrel continued, her foot maintaining its pressure on Braden's throat. Right now, with very little effort, I could make sure you never bully anyone again. Braden's eyes went wide with terror as he realized she wasn't bluffing. Whatever he had awakened in quiet Kestrel Yamamoto was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But I won't, she said, stepping back and allowing him to breathe freely. Because I'm not like you. I don't hurt people who can't defend themselves. She looked down at all three of them, Braden clutching his broken nose, Riker slumped against the wall, Madison cowering by the dumpster. This ends now, Kestrel said. All of it. The names, the harassment, the cruelty. Because if it doesn't end, if you ever come near me or my friends again, I'll show you what real fighting looks like. As she walked away, her grandfather's sweater unmarked and her dignity intact, she heard Madison whispering frantically into her phone, calling for help, but Kestrel felt no fear of consequences. For the first time since arriving at Roosevelt High, she felt truly free. The news of the confrontation spread through the school like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew that quiet Kestrel Yamamoto had single-handedly defeated 3 of Roosevelt High's most feared bullies. The story grew with each retelling, but the core truth remained. The girl they had dismissed as weak and foreign had proven herself to be anything but. Jamie Chen found her at lunch, sitting at their usual corner table with her homemade bento. I heard what happened, he said quietly as he sat down. Thank you. For what? For standing up. For all of us. Other students began approaching their table throughout the week. Quiet kids who had been bullied, overlooked students who had never found their voice, even some of the popular crowd who had grown tired of Braden's reign of terror. Braden himself returned to school 3 days later with a bandaged nose and a noticeably different attitude. He no longer strutted through the hallways like he owned them. His voice had lost its cruel edge, and whenever he saw Kestrel, he quickly found somewhere else to be. On Friday afternoon, as Kestrel walked toward the exit, she noticed a group of students gathered around the martial arts demonstration sign-up sheet. To her surprise, her name had been added to the list, written in Jamie's careful handwriting. I thought you might want to show everyone what real martial arts looks like, he explained when she found him at his locker. Not the movie stuff, the real thing. Kestrel considered the idea. For years, she had hidden her abilities, kept her grandfather's legacy secret out of shame and fear. But perhaps it was time to stop hiding. Perhaps it was time to honor the courage that lived in every thread of her sweater. Okay, she said, surprising herself with the decision. I'll do it. The demonstration took place the following week in front of the entire school. As Kestrel walked onto the gymnasium floor wearing her grandfather's navy sweater, she could feel hundreds of eyes watching her. But for the first time, the attention didn't make her want to disappear. She began with basic forms, her movements flowing like poetry in motion. Each technique was precise, controlled, beautiful in its deadly efficiency. The gymnasium fell silent as students realized they were watching something extraordinary. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. But more important than the recognition was the look of understanding in her classmates' eyes. They finally saw her not as a victim to be pitied or an outsider to be feared, but as someone worthy of respect. Later, as she was leaving the gymnasium, she found Braden waiting by the exit. For a moment, she tensed, prepared for another confrontation. But instead of anger, she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Shame. I'm sorry, he said quietly, the words coming out rough and reluctant, for everything. I was wrong. Kestrel studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But she saw only genuine remorse, the kind that comes from having your worldview thoroughly shattered. "Apology accepted," she said finally. "Just don't let it happen again." As she walked home that afternoon, her grandfather's sweater warming her against the autumn chill, Kestrel reflected on everything that had changed. She had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself meant more than just protecting your own dignity. Sometimes it meant protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes it meant honoring the legacy of those who came before you. The embroidered character on her chest caught the late afternoon sun, its meaning clearer now than ever before. Courage wasn't just about having strength, it was about knowing when to use that strength and when to show mercy. It was about standing up without becoming the thing you stood against. Roosevelt High would never be the same, and neither would she.